Hello and welcome to Canopy, City of Melbourne's Green Infrastructure Forum. And hello to all the regulars that come along to Canopy normally and to our first timers attending today. I'm Gail Hall, your MC for the event and coordinator of Green Infrastructure at the City of Melbourne. With over 700 registered attendees today, I'm really interested to find out who is listening in. So tell me where you're tuning in from in the chat. So it's just in the top right-hand corner of the screen. You may need to sign into chat, and that will be helpful for later if you have a question in our Q&A section. And that will be at the end of the event. So let's get started. And talking about where we are located, and given today is the start of National Reconciliation Week, is as important as ever to show respect for country. As a representative of the City of Melbourne, I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. So, in the chat, who have we got coming in from different places? So, have we got people coming in from all over Australia? Looks like from Queensland and New South Wales. So, I'm excited to be here today, if only for the fact that it's the first time I've left the house for work since March. And I'm also excited, really, to be sharing something with you we've been working on now for a while, Melbourne's Green Factor Tool. Today you'll hear from a range of speakers who will give you the detail you need about the Melbourne Green Factor. We have Ben Foster from the City of Melbourne, Judy Bush from the University of Melbourne, Jock Gammon from Junglefy, and finally, Councillor Cathy Oke from the City of Melbourne. I'm interested in why so many people are tuning in today to this event. So let everyone know in the chat why you're here. It could be where you work, what your role is, or what particular interest you have that you want to share with people today. And while you're doing that, I'll get started on why we're here today. We've all faced enormous challenges this year with devastating bushfires followed by COVID-19. But it's important that we all continue to take bold action on climate while responding to these events. Because Melbourne is already experiencing hotter days, more intense storms and flooding, as well as sea level rise. We know that action is needed now if Melbourne is to remain a livable city for future generations to visit, work and live in. And this is why we declared a climate emergency and biodiversity emergency last year. Rapid population growth and densification is moving the city away from natural landscapes to the hard infrastructure of a highly urbanised environment. This is particularly true in the private realm. Climate change is compounding the effect of this urbanisation with flooding and heat waves, having a huge impact on the city. City of Melbourne has a strong record of reducing emissions, restoring and conserving biodiversity, and preparing our community for the impacts of climate change. However, as a council, we're only responsible for 30% of the land in our municipality. That's why we need help from the private sector if we're going to really move the dial on increased greening in Melbourne. The Green Our City Strategic Action Plan was developed in 2017 to help target actions to increase greening, particularly in the private realm. This included investigating planning requirements and assessment tools. Recently, we identified these actions as key priorities, among others, for accelerated action as a response to the climate and biodiversity emergency. This exciting new amendment is to be considered by Council later this year, and you'll hear more about it then. So to prepare for this amendment, we've been working on a unique tool called the Green Factor. It's the first online version of the tool that we know of, and is used to measure and improve greening outcomes for new development. We hope that this will help to increase vegetation cover, particularly on private land in Melbourne. Now, Ben Foster will be our first speaker for this evening. Ben is an experienced environmental engineer who has worked in sustainable buildings policy and design for over 12 years in both consulting and local government. As a senior green infrastructure and ESD officer, he is a point of contact between the development industry and the City of Melbourne for all things sustainability. Ben managed the development of the Green Factor, which is why he's now going to give you a rundown of the tool. Over to you, Ben.
Hi, thanks, Cal. It's really exciting to be here to launch the voluntary stage of our Green Factor tool. So I'm going to take you through a bit of background about how we've created this tool, what it can deliver, how you can use it, and where it's going to go in the future. So the Green Factor tool for Melbourne is really, it's a tool that helps quantify and benchmark the quality of greening on your building. We have many aims when we're looking at this, but primarily we want to increase the amount and quality of greening across the city on new buildings. And we want to ensure that that greening contributes to the City of Melbourne's climate and biodiversity emergency response in meaningful ways that benefit both the occupants of the city and the environment in general. We also aim that it will provide meaningful guidance to designers so that they're able to deliver innovative responses to greening concepts from inception of projects through to the built outcome. So you might wonder what the Green Factor actually is. And it's a fairly simple calculation. At its simplest, the Green Factor calculation is a weighted area of greening on a site as a proportion of the total site area. And look, it's not a new concept. It's been around since the 1980s in Berlin with their biotope area factor, which is a regulatory tool. And since then, it's been applied in quite a few different contexts globally, in both regulatory and non-regulatory contexts, with Helsinki and London being the sort of the latest and greatest up until this point. And in Australia, we've had a little bit of experience with it in Strathfield with a green amenity factor that was used in the early thousands to help developers look at greening on their sites. So essentially what we'll see with our Green Factor is different types of greening all coming together and being ranked on their contributions to the environment, spitting out a Green Factor score that allows easy benchmarking for designers, easy benchmarking for planners and regulatory bodies, and a nice benchmark for people to score against their own designs. So when we were developing the Green Factor tool for a Melbourne context, we looked at a range of key principles that would guide the way we did it. So firstly, it had to align with our key environmental strategies. That was very important. We have a very solid suite of environmental strategies to draw from. And then secondly, it must have a very strong evidence base. This is a bit of a drawback in some of the global precedents in that the way greening was scored on these sites was very subjective, whereas we've chosen to make sure that any greening benefits are linked very explicitly to the best in academic research that we have available. We want it to be a simple and intuitive user experience to use this tool. We want it to be really easy to put into a design flow. And then in the design area, we wanted to make sure that it was a non-prescriptive approach. We trust our architects, we trust our landscape architects to be able to apply design autonomy and have good design. We want the tool to reward good design. We also want it to be flexible and adaptable for wider application beyond just the City of Melbourne. And so that's led us to the 100% online tool that we're going through today. So what do we want to see when we see greening across the city? That was one of the big questions that we asked, and I'm going to take you through some of the environmental drivers and outcomes that we want to see happening across the city as a result of this. So urban temperature regulation and the urban heat island effect is one of the key benefits that greening can bring. So we want to reward designs that bring vegetation into the city that provide active cooling. We also want to see greening designs that come in to provide enhanced and additional habitat for increased biodiversity across the city. In Melbourne, stormwater and runoff mitigation is a very large concern in some areas, with flash flooding being a frequent problem. So we want to also encourage greening designs that provide stormwater responses. Now, in terms of green spaces that provide recreation, I think during this time of COVID-19 and lockdown for people, I think there's a new recognition of the benefit that green spaces and access to green spaces for urban city dwellers can have a benefit to people's lives. And we want to make sure that our new buildings are providing green and open spaces for people to play. And so, building on that social theme, we also want to make sure that the greening that is implemented in the city really contributes to a sense of place and is able to help us build community through social cohesion, spaces for people to congregate that are green and nice to be in. We want to look at the areas around community and food supply that can be provided. And then finally, looking at the aesthetic benefits and how greening the city can result in a much more beautiful place to live in, to visit, and just to be around. So this is the main sort of outcomes that we're trying to get when we're looking at this Green Factor tool. So as part of the process for developing this, we've done a lot of external testing with a large stakeholder group of landscaping professionals, architects, development community, government and academia. And we've done a very comprehensive testing and calibration process to look at how our Green Factor score relates to other targets that we have. So the Greenhouse City Strategic Action Plan that Gail mentioned has a provisional 40% horizontal greening target. And so a big part of our work was in translating that greening target to the Green Factor typologies, which you can see on the right hand of the screen here. So for each particular typology, we undertook an extensive calibration process where ground level features that were equal to that 40% coverage were added to output average Green Factor scores to be targeted. And then we had landscape architects undergo an iterative design process, looking at the different types of vegetation that would need to be applied on those buildings to meet that target score. So here's a bit of an indication here for one of our high-rise residential typologies. We were looking at business as usual with small podium greening and a vegetated terrace compared to the Greenhouse City target, which has much larger communal areas on the rooftop. We also looked at optimized greening outcomes where the landscape architect looked at the different types of greening that can be applied to maximize that score. And you can see here that there's an extensive biodiversity green roof added to this building, as well as some additional vertical facade greening to get that increased score. So I just have a couple of examples here of some of the typologies we've tested. So you can see the high-rise commercial development here with podium level greening and ground level, as well as some on-structure planters at high level. We have a mid-rise residential with extensive rooftop gardening and facade greening, and our previous example as well. We also have some of our smaller residential typologies. So it was tested against single occupancy dwellings, some townhouse developments. These already have quite stringent regulatory requirements for garden areas, so there was less to apply to these in a sense. You can also see in the small apartment complex here in the top left of the screen that we have some rooftop terraces and a vegetated central courtyard. And it's quite interesting to note with this particular project that it's a real project that's gone through planning. So it's really nice to see projects meeting and exceeding the target benchmarks already. Now on the right-hand side of the screen, we have our industrial typology, which is a small warehousing complex. The testing process found that for industrial typologies, due to the constraints around goods movements and heavy vehicles, it was much harder to apply the higher levels of greening. So through that design process, looking at the various types of greening that could be applied, it was found that a 0.25 score was more appropriate for the industrial typology. And this target is something that will continue to be refined throughout our testing and voluntary phase of the tool. So how do you get a green factor score? Will be the moment of truth here. So when you want to get a green factor, you'll need a few things first. You need to have some concept plans and sketches of the building and the greening types, or at least a very, a good idea of the sort of greening you'd like to apply. You need your site area. And for vegetation, you need a quantity of trees that are being applied. And then for all other vegetation types, you need square meter quantities of those. So we all know that vegetation and trees need soil to grow. So you're going to need soil area and depths to input, and this is particularly important for your ground level canopy trees. You're going to need around 15 minutes to an hour or two, depending on the complexity of the project. We find there's a sort of a sweet spot around 30 minutes to an hour for most. If you've got a very complex building with a lot of different types of greening on it, then it might take a little bit longer. And there's our address right there, www.greenfactor.com.au. I'm going to jump in there now and run you through a quick example of how it works, but I encourage you to get on there and have a play around yourself. All right, so here's our Green Factor website. So when you arrive on the website, this is what you're going to see. If you jump into about this tool, it'll give you some background information on how it was put together, how to use it, and should you need assistance, you can contact us via the email link on the screen there. So you can start assessing a new site, or you can load an existing assessment that you've done earlier and save. So I'm just going to load one up that I've used before. And so this is the main interface for the tool. When you come in, you enter some details about your site, the address, the land area, and the typology of the building. You're asked some questions around good design practice, whether you're engaging a landscape architect, are you developing a maintenance plan, those sorts of things. There's also some questions around water supply, some applicant details, and then it's time to start inputting your different types of vegetation. And we have in-ground vegetation, existing, retained. So that's for when you're keeping trees and vegetation on site, which is highly rewarded in the tool. There's new in-ground vegetation, green walls, green facades, planters on structure, and green roofs. So I'm just going to show you in here one of these to see the sort of information you're going to input. So I'm going to go to planters on structure. And the first thing we're going to get is a bunch of questions that relate to how things score in the tool. So we have, are green elements in this area available for occupants' use or visible to the public? And are they available for use by the general public? So these relate to the social aspects of greening. There's also questions around the height above ground that things are located, and this relates to their biodiversity and heat responses. So when we go in to actually specify our elements, we have different types of vegetation you can input. So there's different sizes of trees, shrubs, ground covers available to you to put in. And in those, they're broken down into indigenous, native, exotic, and productive types. So if you want to learn more, you can click on the Learn More here, and it will bring up some additional information that helps you decide what you're putting in, as well as some definitions. So just for this one, I put in 50 square meters of small shrubs and planters, and I've added some 50 square meters of soil to go along with those. So once you've completed all that, you can go through and have a look at your scorecard. And here's your Green Factor scorecard that outputs your final Green Factor score. And there's a bunch of information here that helps you interrogate your design a little bit closer. So you can see that for your green elements, they're ranked by their percentage contribution to the green factor. So for this one, 27% is from ground cover. And you can also look over here on the bottom left, the location of green elements is also laid out for you. So you can see that your in-ground new vegetation for this particular example is contributing almost 60% of that green factor score. The one I think that's actually most interesting for users of the tool is this ecosystem outcomes graphic up the top here, and you can make that larger and have a look at just how your design is contributing to those different ecosystem functions that we were looking at before. So this particular design is contributing very well to urban temperature regulation because of all our ground level trees. Habitat for biodiversity, again, because of the trees, our small shrubs and ground covers, and a little bit to do with our surface runoff due to our soil volumes. So it's a really useful tool to sort of look at how your particular design is contributing and how you might be able to change it around to provide even greater benefits. There's also a schedule of the elements you use. And this particular scorecard here, you can print it off to PDF to be part of your planning application or as your documentation. You can save your progress in a file, or another thing you can do is upload the scoring information, which sends just the inputs for the scoring to allow us to help refine the scores. So there's no private information gathered in that. It's purely the inputs that give you that green factor score. So that's essentially the green factor scorecard, and I really encourage you to get on there and have a play around with some of your designs and see what you can come up with. I'm just going to jump to my final slide. So there's a few things that we want to look at for the future functionality of the tool beyond what it can do now. And we're investigating the capability to look at precincts, and we'll determine open space factors, green factors for that. We'd like to apply it to retrofits and extensions, and then also looking at opportunities for customization for other cities and regions within Australia, and setting weightings for the green infrastructure elements to suit those individual contexts. So if you're interested in how the green factor tool can be applied to your particular context, please get in touch. We'd love to speak with you. But in the meantime, jump in and play around with the tool. And I really welcome your feedback and hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. A really good rundown, and I love those hand-drawn images of the greenery in the presentation. So if anyone has a question for Ben, add it to the chat and we'll answer as many as we can after everyone's presentation. I've already got a chat from one of our regulars, Kath from Mount Alexander Shire, so we'll be asking that later. Going back to the chat from earlier, joining us, lots of people across the industry. We've got the Nursery and Garden Industry Association of Victoria. We've got councils from New South Wales, locally across Victoria, some of our consultants, track consultants, City of Hobart, even Glasgow. So really interesting people coming through. And now we're going to hear from Judy. So Dr. Judy Bush is a lecturer in urban planning. Judy's research and teaching focuses on urban green space policy and governance in a changing climate. Prior to her PhD research, she worked in local government alliances on climate change and on waterway restoration and biodiversity conservation. Her combination of academic research and teaching experience with previous non-academic practitioner-focused roles uniquely equips her to deliver industry-relevant transdisciplinary research. This is why she was engaged to work on developing the evidence base for the Green Factor tool, which is what she will tell you about now. Thanks, Judy.
Thanks, Gail. Thanks very much. And hello, everyone. I am imagining many people listening to me through my computer screen, which is a slightly strange experience. But anyway, great to be able to talk to lots of people today. So I'm going to be presenting on the process that I went through working with the consultants in City of Melbourne to build the evidence base. As Ben said, there was a need to have a really strong evidence base for this tool. And so I'm going to take you through the process that I went through to ensure a really strong evidence base. So customising the Green Factor tool for Melbourne involves acknowledging and building in the local context, the local strategic priorities and local research. And I worked with the other consultants, led by Hip versus Hype. Little Sketches did the software and website material, and we also had a partner at University of Helsinki who could share with us experience from the Helsinki Green Factor tool, which we then built into the Melbourne tool. So my work as the researcher in this process was stepping through these 6 research steps. And I won't read out all the words on this slide because I'm going to go through them each one by one. So first up, the first step was identifying the green infrastructure forms and functions. And so you've already seen what the answer is. I'm going through, Ben took you through that answer. I'm going through how we got to that answer. So first up was identifying the green space forms, and we defined that based on vegetation strata or layers. So as Ben said, you know, large trees, medium trees, small trees, and so on. In terms of green space functions, we turned to urban ecosystem services as a conceptual framework. And you can see here on the slide the 4 different categories of urban ecosystem services: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. And so we reviewed each of these ecosystem services to assess which could actually be delivered at individual building scale or individual property scale. And so we came up with a list of 8 ecosystem services, and you can see them there. And our next step was to then prioritise, so to actually now link the research, the research on ecosystem services with what council's strategic objectives were. So to link those ecosystem services and then to prioritise them. And so to do that, we ran a workshop with council's planning, landscapes and infrastructure staff, and went through a process together of negotiating which were the most important of the ecosystem services. And so they came out in that order there. So urban temperature regulation and cooling was the most important of the functions, which reflects Melbourne's exposure to heat waves, really. Habitat for biodiversity is also very important, and then down the list, runoff mitigation, so stormwater runoff, recreation, air purification, place values, social cohesion, aesthetic benefits, and food supply. So taking those functions, my role was then to identify research demonstrating how each of those functions are delivered. And so I built a matrix listing the forms and functions, and then listing the ecosystem services. And I dived into the research literature. I looked first for research that was developed here in Melbourne, then research for Southeast Australia, Southern Australia, and then more globally, but still specifically looking at temperate urban contexts. And I used local literature reviews, so there's a couple there on the screen. And I also particularly targeted the research of local researchers. I used academic databases and carried out keyword function searches. And I then followed up citations of key references. So it was quite a thorough task identifying the research. That gave us a really amazing matrix of material. And then the next step was to weight the relative contribution of the different forms. So whether it's a tree, a shrub, ground cover, and so on. So weighting their relative contribution to the delivery of those functions. And so that, again, was based on the research findings. And for example, trees are really important form of vegetation for providing cooling function. And so they had a higher weighting for cooling than, for example, shrubs do. So then the next step was taking this evidence matrix that I had built that has the reference material, the research material, and also the proposed weightings of those, the relative weightings. And I then exposed it to peer review by a whole batch of local researchers. So I held a workshop with landscape architecture researchers. I held another workshop with researchers from the Green Infrastructure Research Group based out at Burnley, Melbourne Uni, and urban ecologists. And as a result of that discussion with local researchers, we adjusted the weightings of some of the various forms and functions. And importantly, we actually deleted the air purification function. And this was because we received advice from our researchers that vegetation wasn't nearly as significant in air purification, outdoor air pollution management as vehicle emission controls. And so, you know, we were told that relatively speaking, in a country like Australia, vegetation played a relatively minimal role in air pollution mitigation. So we were advised to delete it just so that we could make the tool as effective as possible, but also as simple as possible. If I have time at the end, I'll talk a bit more about air purification, given that many Australian cities were then blanketed in bushfire smoke over summer. So I can talk a bit more about further reflections on that if we have time, but I feel like I need to move on. So after those peer review workshops, the revised matrix was then presented to council's landscape staff as the fourth workshop. And so following all that peer review and discussion and examination, we were able to finalise the weightings and evidence matrix. And there's a little corner of it there that you can see. And at that point, it was then handed over to the landscape architects to then be able to test and calibrate the ratings using a range of existing and planned developments, and Ben showed you that process. So I just wanted to really quickly finish by saying that for me, I found it a really exciting process to be involved in, and I think that there's a lot of value in research being able to work with practice and policy making, and that we can each contribute specific experience and skills and expertise that together really create a very rigorous and solid piece of work. And so I thank City of Melbourne for the opportunity to work with them on this. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Please contact me if you'd like more information. And follow me on Twitter.
Thank you for that, Judy. It's great to see all the research that has gone into the Green Factor and the evidence base that sits behind it. So if anyone has a question for Judy, please add it to the chat. Now we're going to hear from Jock. So Jock Gammon is the Managing Director and co-founder of Junglefy. He's a horticulturalist, an environmental scientist, and Jock loves plants and understands their power for making cities more livable. Jock continues to challenge the status quo through investing in research and the science behind innovative products like the Junglefy breathing wall and other new technologies. His desire to create a better place for future generations is helping to shape the living infrastructure market, both locally and globally. Today, he'll be talking about his experience using the Green Factor for a Melbourne planning application, which was last week endorsed by Melbourne City Council. This was the first ever application using Melbourne's Green Factor tool. Over to you, Jock.
Thank you, Gail. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Gamaragal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm presenting up in New South Wales, and to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. My name's Jock Gammon. As per Gail's introduction, I'm the founder and managing director of Junglefy, and we're on a mission to junglefy our cities. As you know, our cities are facing a handful of significant challenges. We've got significant populations in our cities, and this is causing issues with regards to air quality and the urban heat island effect. We're seeing significant loss of biodiversity within the city and also on the peri-urban fringes, and humans are losing their connection with nature. And this is having significant impacts on health and well-being and mental health and well-being also. Our cities are becoming human zoos, or should I say, were becoming human zoos. The great work that the City of Melbourne's been doing, especially through the introduction of their future Melbourne 2026 plan, identified that what Melbournians wanted was a city that cares for its environment and one that maintains the urban biosphere. With the opportunities limited within our cities to create due to urban density, there is a need now more than ever to create, look at ways of incorporating greenery on our buildings and other grey infrastructure. The Greenhouse Cities Action Plan outlines the ways that councils and the community can substantially increase the living infrastructure in our cities. The latest and most exciting part of this plan is the reason we're here this afternoon, which is for the launch of the Green Factor tool. Now, I had the privilege of being involved in the development of the Green Factor tool and also the honour of actually putting the first project through the Green Factor tool. And it's for this project at 14 to 26 Bruce Street in Kensington. This project is by the Medley Property Group and has been designed by Carr Architects in conjunction with Urbis, Sydney Design Collective and Junglefy. And I'll take you through a few of the iterations of the project now. You can see the brick facade, which ties in significantly with the Kensington area. But the original concept was lacking that connection with nature and that sense of scale within the city space. It was quite a heavy structure, and the council, in conjunction with Medley and the team, we looked at how we can soften the facade with the incorporation of greenery. And you can see here, concept 2 was our first pass. We've got a mixture of natives and exotics, and we put the project through the Green Factor tool. And whilst the minimum requirement for the project is 0.55, we scored 0.59, but we knew we could do better. So we took it back to the drawing board and we created what you see here as the final concept. And I've repeated concept 2 here just for clarification of the development of the process. We added extra greenery, again, that extra sense of scale. And one of the important things, and we know this from previous projects, is it's really important to have a mixture of cascading and voluminous type plants, because you need to be able to appreciate these buildings from all directions when you're walking up the street. A lot of the concepts are done from front on and you get this beautiful view, but you actually need to be able to connect with nature from all different aspects. And this is why we really focus on cascading plants and trees and other voluminous plants, as I've discussed. So we got to put the project through the process again, through the Green Factor tool, and it scored a score of 0.66. So it was a significant step above the 0.55 requirement. And here I'm showing the initial concept to the final concept. So a really big improvement on the visual amenity. Now, whilst we focused on the visual amenity of the human scale, we also were playing a big focus on some of the other inhabitants of Kensington that we can't quite see, which are the animals and the invertebrates. And a key part of this design is to actually create conduit for the invertebrates and animals up the facade of the building. So we've got this connectivity, as you can see, winding up the two sides of the building. And this leads up to, I guess, a significant scale biodiversity roof. So the Bruce Street project has a green roof that's particularly focused on biodiversity. We're going to be working with the University of Melbourne and the City of Melbourne to make this part of an ongoing research project that the University of Melbourne has been doing, and make this project an example of what can be done with these types of buildings within the city context. Now, whilst the project isn't publicly available, a key part of the offering to the City of Melbourne and the inhabitants there was that this research would become publicly available. We'd be making regular updates throughout the installation and also the maintenance of the project, but ongoing through the years of research and learnings that we find across the project. Research and development is a key part of Junglefy's ethos. We've been researching air quality, the use of plants to remove air pollutants, and further to what Judy says, we think that the Green Factor Tool and the use of plants to remove air pollution is something that may be considered potentially in Melbourne, but certainly other municipalities around Australia where the opportunity for removing air pollution is needed. So a key part of biodiversity projects, in our view and our experience, is that we need to have a mixture of native and exotic plants. And the beauty of green roofs and green walls is they provide an opportunity to have a vast array of different plants flowering at different times of the year, because this is what's missing generally in our cities, is the general planting palette of a council due to maintenance requirements is somewhat limited. But what we can do with green roofs and green walls on private buildings is really have a vast array of different flowering species to attract the biodiversities. We can create habitats, and I'll show you some projects shortly where we've done this up in Sydney. So these types of projects represent fantastic opportunities to bring nature back to our cities and reconnect humans with nature. Humans, I think, have lost touch with nature. We are sort of seen as the apex within the ecosystem, but we need to become more holistic as part of nature rather than leading and dominating it. Another key part of this project, the Bruce Street project, is that it sits directly adjacent to the Moonee Ponds Creek, where the City of Melbourne has a big focus on restoring the biodiversity there. And if we can start to use buildings as another part of that biodiversity development within the city, it represents fantastic opportunities to create cities that are having a huge impact on now and future generations. And what's great about the Green Factor Tool is that it not only focuses on the human scale, but it focuses on this biodiversity scale. And I think that's a real opportunity that many other councils and organisations can learn from, about that extra sense of what plants in our cities can do. So this is one of our first biodiverse green roof projects. It's up at Barangaroo in Sydney. I love this photo because it's a real juxtaposition. We've got the little bee hotel here. It's built into the roof with compacted soil or compacted earth that we know native bees inhabit. And then you've got the Crown Casino in the background. So the two scales of the bee hotel and the Crown Hotel, I think, are a fantastic example of the city scale and what we need to be doing to reintroduce biodiversity back into our cities. And we have observed European honeybees, we've observed native bees, spiders, and all sorts of insects up on the roof. So it's been a really successful project, and this is 6 months after planting. We've also have a big focus on using green walls for biodiversity. You can see here we've got pollinator hotels that are incorporated into our green walls or breathing walls. And we then use hoardings to actually bring that nature back to our cities. And this, again, is that really important connection to scale. So if our construction sites can be bringing plants and biodiversity, these hoardings can then be rolled onto the modules or plants from the building. Hoardings can then be rolled onto the buildings and creating that sense of nature, connection with nature all the way through the construction and development process. So these are really exciting opportunities, again, for bringing more plants to our cities. So look, it's now more important than ever that we change the way our cities are built. We need to start building projects that are regenerative and not merely less bad versions of what we've been building. We've got many challenges on our hands, such as competing regulations with the likes of fire on facades and water management. But if we as a collective society can change the way that our cities are built and bring more nature and plants to our cities, then we can have a real and significant impact on the way our cities are built for future generations. In summary, a quote that I took from the City of Melbourne's Nature in the City strategy: "The relationship between the city's ecology and the health of our community has never been clearer. We need nature and nature needs us." So before I finish up, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Gail Hall and her team from the City of Melbourne, who have been instrumental in bringing more plants to our cities and reconnecting people with nature. Without their work, we would not be here today celebrating the introduction of this important tool. It would be great to see this tool rolled out across Australia and many other municipalities. And I look forward to working with many of you around the country as we bring more plants to our cities. So on that note, I'd like to say thanks for listening, and we look forward to junglefying our cities with you in the future.
Thank you, Jock. It's great to see the Green Factor coming to life in a real project. If anyone has a question for Jock, add it to the chat. We've got loads already, which is brilliant, and we'll be getting to those questions soon. Now we're going to hear from our very own Councillor Cathy Oke. Councillor Oke was first elected to the Melbourne City Council in 2008, and she's Chair of the Environment Portfolio and Deputy Chair of the Finance and Governance and Aboriginal City Portfolios. She's one of the tool's biggest advocates and has a key task in making the launch of the voluntary phase official. Take it away, Cathy. Councillor Oke.
Cathy is fine. I see many friends on the YouTube channel, and so absolutely, Cathy is fine. And thank you very much, Gail, for your superb MC work and also the carriage of this work for so long. Before I go into more on that, I'd like to obviously acknowledge and pay my respects to the elders of the land that I sit on here in Kensington. Fabulous to join you from my desk here, but I certainly acknowledge that I am on the Wurrung land of the Kulin Nation here in Kensington, and I pay my respects to elders both past, present and emerging, and I do acknowledge that not only, well, yesterday was Sorry Day, National Sorry Day, but today is the start of Reconciliation Week, and highly encourage you to get involved in Reconciliation Week events that I'm sure many of your organisations across Australia are hosting as we are at this. So certainly get involved in those. I'd like to echo the excitement and enthusiasm of all of our speakers and thank them. You know, Gail, Ben, Jock, Judy, you're all being, your presentations sum up the excitement and the opportunity that this Green Factor tool provides Melbourne, but also hopefully, Victoria and the rest of Australia. And I can see a lot of great conversations about how this tool can be used and utilised and, wide and far. So certainly excited about that and certainly excited to see where this goes and acknowledge not only our speakers today, but I can see also on the YouTube channel, I can see many people that have contributed to the development of this Melbourne Green Factor tool through any of our workshops, in testing the tool for us, contributing to the research, and also I can see many colleagues of ours from the City of Melbourne who are online as well, and I'd like to acknowledge all of your work in reflecting on this soft launch. It's obviously voluntary phase at the moment, but it's an important milestone. But in reflecting on this with Gail yesterday, I was reminded that actually, in 2009, I've been at council for a long time, but it was one of the very first planning applications that came to me in 2009. It was for a green roof in South Yarra. And for whatever reason, we know there's lots of reasons, but it wasn't possible. And it really, and I remember having that conversation with Gail, who was in the planning team at that time, I believe. And for various reasons, it really highlighted to me as a new a new councillor, the real disconnect between our sustainability goals and the planning scheme, but also a disconnect between, you know, the urban landscapes team and the sustainability teams, branches within the City of Melbourne and the planning team. And there really needed to be a lot more connection and work to make sure that we could realise the goals that we have for our city and use the planning scheme for it. And, you know, one attempt failed to get up a Green Factor tool, but then, as you've heard, you know, in 2017 we did unanimously support the Greenhouse City Action Plan, and this tool this Green Factor tool was a key aspect of that unanimous support from the City of Melbourne councillors. And I just am blown away by what has been developed, and I really very proud of the City of Melbourne and everyone involved in this tool. And so, as you've heard, you know, in launching the Green Factor tool today, we're essentially asking developers to voluntarily, it's still voluntary, and I've seen a few questions about that online. It is certainly voluntary. We're not expecting developers to use this tool, but we would love it if you did have a go, like Jock has explained, you know, using it to trial and error for the development in Bruce Street. You know, we'd love it for any developers to start using the Green Factor tool. We're requesting that you aim for, is it a 0.55 target? And certainly during the voluntary phase, we're not holding anyone to it. But we're absolutely there, ready to provide assistance on how to use it and how to document a response. And you know that you'll get some great feedback from Ben and Gail and the team as you do that. And I think as Jock has explained, you can only get benefits not only for your development but also the community and also the nature that is in our city. And that's really what this is all about. It's about livability. It's about greening our city for people, for the plants, for the animals, for the, you know, for a livable Melbourne. And I really look forward to seeing how it develops and how we can expand it and start to use it to green the private land in our city, because that's how we're going to get to the targets that we have. So thank you again, everyone. And now, I really look forward to the question and answer section of this fabulous Canopy event. Thank you, Gail.
Thanks, Councillor Oke. I can't wait to see the scorecards coming across Ben's desk. And now, so those are the formal presentations that we've had. Thank you to all the speakers. Really interesting and succinct. So thank you for that. We'll move on to the questions now. So start off with a question for Judy. We've got questions around not what made it into the Green Factor, but what didn't make it into the Green Factor. So why didn't we put in reducing carbon emissions, for example, or air purification? I know you touched on that earlier, but could you just expand on that quickly? And that's from, one of those questions is from Heather.
Thank you. Thanks, Gail. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, everyone. Okay, first up, the carbon emissions question. So the key way that carbon emissions are reduced is by reducing the use of fossil fuels. And so here in Australia, with a lot of our energy generated by fossil fuels, our electricity rather, if we can reduce electricity use, then that will be a key contributor to reducing carbon emissions. And really that is embedded in the very first function, which received the highest weighting, which is the heat mitigation. One of the, we all know during a heat wave that the use of air conditioners can create peak load on our electricity system. So really being able to reduce heat is a key way to actually reduce electricity use, and when electricity is fossil fuel generated, then that in itself will reduce carbon emissions. So we certainly didn't ignore carbon emissions. The other key way that plants can contribute to emission reductions is through sequestration. And we decided that sequestration, so that's, plants storing carbon, we decided that on a building scale, that was less significant than the other functions. And so therefore, due to trying to keep the tool as simple as possible, we didn't include it. Obviously, it's a really important function, but it would happen at a larger scale. In terms of air pollution, we all experienced, probably most of us in the room experienced the incredible bushfire smoke. And that was such a huge event. It would be fantastic if plants were able to mitigate that. But given we actually saw satellite photos of bushfire smoke circling the globe, I think any vegetation on buildings is not going to be able to address those really huge events. Furthermore, we applied the idea of pollution mitigation and thinking about point source versus diffuse source. Now, you know, when you've got really large sources of air pollution like bushfire smoke, it's very difficult to actually mitigate them. Where you have point source, most of the air pollution point source that we can think of is vehicle exhaust. And so the best, most effective way to address that type of air pollution is actually to improve vehicle emission standards. And so we really did default back to, okay, that's where the policy effort should go, and we will take it out of the tool for that reason. And it really was trying to make the tool as simple yet effective and powerful as possible. So balancing those different needs.
Thank you, Judy. Okay, so we got another question here from Meg and Jess. How easy will it be for other local government authorities to adopt the Green Factor tool, and what is the timing for introducing regulation? So as we said earlier, we are looking this year to get City of Melbourne Council to make a decision on future planning regulations. So you'll be made aware of that through our channels. But the Green Our City Strategic Action Plan has in there a target of having new planning regulations through in 2021. We'll see how that goes, but that's the target. And another one is around other LGAs adopting the Green Factor tool. As Ben said in his presentation, that's something we certainly thought about when we developed the tool itself. We have developed it so that it can be modified, and we're certainly happy to have those conversations. Please get in touch if you're from a local government authority or an organisation who think might be useful for you. Please get in touch with us. Okay, we'll move on to the next question. We've got Kath from Mount Alexandershire, and she is wondering if there is there potential for this to be applied not just in the city where we are, but what about in other areas, regional and rural towns, such as what's in Mount Alexandershire, I imagine. Ben.
Thanks for the question, Kath. Yeah, look, I think absolutely there's great opportunity to apply this to contexts outside of the metro areas. And the process to do that is fairly simple in that we'd need to look at the individual drivers for those rural and regional towns. So in Mount Alexander, for example, you would sit down and undergo a similar process to what we did in assigning priorities to different environmental indicators and your different areas you want to address. And then on top of that, you would then look at the different greening typologies that you typically see in rural and regional contexts. So this could be similar to what we're looking at with our precincts tool and looking at the greater contribution that trees give when given more space and opportunity to grow. But I think definitely it's something that we're able to adjust the tool to deliver, yes.
Great. Okay, now we're on to our final question. Wrapping up, so we have, for Jock, we have Hayley, and she would like to know, at what stage in the project lifecycle do you introduce the concept of urban greening?
Hi, Hayley. Thanks for your question. It's important to bring the concept in as early as possible, and it's making sure that you have a a real solid reason for bringing in the urban greening. It can't just be tokenistic or some level of green bling. It's important that it's there for a functional purpose. As the Green Factor tool sets out, a lot of these inclusions are about serving a measurable benefit for the city and the people that live there. So if it does have a strong function, then it's much more likely to get up through the planning process, but also be looked after as part of a key piece of infrastructure for now and into the future. So the earlier you can get involved, the more holistic and important it is for the project, the better it's going to be for the outcome of everyone. Thanks,
Jock. Okay, so and finally, this wouldn't have been possible without the courage of staff, not me, other staff, and councillors, in particular Councillor Cathy Oke and others at the City of Melbourne, and their courage to be bold and the hard work of the tool developers themselves. So thank you to those. Thank you to all the speakers and those who've asked the questions, and thank you to you, the audience, for attending. Spread the word, use the tool, and make sure you get in touch if you want to know more. Thank you, and stay safe.